Fantastic to see everyone. Okay, good evening. 6:02 p.m. My name is Claire McKenna, and I'm the chair of the Ann Arbor Energy Commission. As the chair, I'm calling this meeting to order, and I'm participating from Ann Arbor. Welcome to the August 8th, 2023 electronic meeting of the Energy Commission. We will conduct this meeting like in-person meetings. Commissioners, during roll call, please indicate your current location. Also during the meeting, please remain on camera, just as you would be visible during in-person meetings. Finally, please mute your microphone when not speaking. Public comment will be via telephone only. To speak during any of the public comment opportunities, please call one of the following two toll-free numbers: 877-853-5247 or 888-788-0099 and enter the ID number 956-8718-7876 on your phone. This information is also available on the published agenda in the public notices section of the city website and on the broadcast meeting and on the broadcast of this meeting on CTN, Channel 16, AT&T Channel 99, and online at a2gov.org/watch-CTN. Joe, would you please read the land acknowledgement for us?
Yep. Excuse me. I acknowledge that the land the city of Ann Arbor occupies is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Bodewadmi, and Wyandot peoples. I further acknowledge that our city stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained, generally in unconscionable ways, from indigenous peoples. The taking of this land was formalized by the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Knowing where we live, work, study, and recreate does not change the past, but a thorough understanding of the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us in our work to create a future that supports human flourishing and justice for all individuals.
Great, thanks, Joe. Will you take the roll call, please?
Yep. All right. Commissioner, and as stated, if you can say where you're calling in from, as you're saying you're present. Commissioner Berkowitz.
Present from my home in Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Briggs notified me they will not be able to make it, as did Vice Chair Colvin or Commissioner Colvin Garcia. Vice Chair Harp.
Present, calling from here in Ann Arbor.
Chair McKenna.
Present, calling from Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Mirsky.
Present, calling in from here in my home in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Overpeck.
Here, calling in from my home in Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Redina.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Sendra was unable to make it as well. Commissioner Smith.
Present in Ann Arbor.
And Commissioner Zittelman.
In Ann Arbor.
And Commissioner Levin. I'm not hearing you, but I see they are present.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, here in Ann Arbor. Sorry about that.
Gotcha. All good. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thanks, Joe. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda as posted and a second? Commissioner Mirsky?
Yes, I move that the agenda be approved as published.
Thank you. And a second? Vice Chair Hart.
Second.
Thank you. All right. Commissioners, please raise your hand if you want to propose changes or discuss an issue. The agenda. Seeing no hands raised, all those in favor of approving the agenda as posted, raise your hand and say aye. All those opposed, please raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. And all those opposed, please raise your hand and say no. Okay, thank you. We have everybody in the aye, so the agenda is approved. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as posted?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Mirsky, and a second, Councilmember Redina. Thank you. Commissioners, please raise your hand if you want to propose changes or discuss an issue. All right, seeing no hands raised, all those in favor of approving the minutes as posted, please raise your hand and say aye.
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 Okay, with the majority voting aye, we have the minutes are approved. All right, we'll move into public input. This is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes. If you're watching on CTN, please call 888-788-0099 or 877-853-5247 and enter the meeting ID 956-8718-7876. This information is also displayed on the meeting agenda and video feed. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone number. To electronically raise your hand to indicate your desire to speak, please press *9 on your phone. You will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sound so that we may hear you clearly. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments.
Caller ending in 134.
Thank you, Mr. Lang and Chair McKenna. I'm Ken Garber. I live at 28 Haverhill Hill Court. I'm looking forward to the discussion on grid availability. Important issue. Commissioner Briggs in her newsletter suggested that residents submit questions during public comment time, so here are mine. 1, I assume that increasing grid availability means adding substation transformers to step down more power off regional high voltage ITC transmission. If new demand is high enough, does this mean entirely new substations need to be built? Question 2, to provide capacity to serve large new developments that include rooftop solar and battery storage, can DTE use these DER capabilities to offset its peak load and thus limit the necessary work to just reconductoring existing circuits instead of doing these substation upgrades? To date, I haven't seen DTE make any effort to adapt its systems for developers who want to put in distributed generation and thus make it easier to add grid capacity. Question 3, Ann Arbor has large areas served by outdated 4.8 kilovolt ungrounded transmission lines, and that's one big reason for our outage problems. DTE acknowledges these need upgrading to 13.2 kilovolt systems. I've heard that 13.2 conversion requires a new substation with a new ITC feed at 120 kilovolt transmission, which in turn requires MISO approval. So lead time is a big issue. My question is, shouldn't DTE be currently replacing its local 4.8 kilovolt local grid with 13.2 kilovolts while building or upgrading the necessary substations to solve our capacity problem? This would address reliability and capacity at the same time. Instead, DTE seems to be avoiding 13.2 conversion, at least here in Ann Arbor, and just hardening the existing 4.8 kilovolt lines. I'd be interested to hear from Mr. Witkowski what DTE's plans are for 4.8 to 13.2 conversion in Ann Arbor. Question 4, I've heard that DTE has charged developers fees on the order of up to $300,000 each to increase capacity to serve new developments. Is this true? And if so, how does DTE justify this, given that the MPSC guarantees the company a 9.9% return on equity for capital improvements? Isn't DTE getting paid twice for the same work, once by the developer and once by ratepayers? Question 5, last one, it's a corollary question. Shouldn't DTE be paying itself for capacity upgrades, like any company making a capital investment in new revenue generating infrastructure? So those are my 5 questions. Do we need new substations? Can DTE leverage DER to reduce the necessary work? The 4.8 to 13.2 conversion, what's DTE's plans for Ann Arbor? DTE's excessive fees to developers and double dipping from the public purse.
We're at time. Thank you.
Thank you.
No further callers.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move into discussion. I'll share a little bit about this component of what we have on the agenda and kind of the thinking behind what we put together here. So the thought was to have a bit of a roundtable discussion, and so we invited two speakers to come today to the meeting. We invited Professor Seth Goikema from U of M. He was unable to join us live right now because he got a flight delay, but he provided a recorded statement. And we also have Mike Witkowski here on the call. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. We're excited to speak with you. So we've asked both of these folks to come and prepare some brief remarks, and I'm going to share kind of the prompt, just so you have a sense of what the kind of concept around the sharing will be. And so then after we hear the two shares, then I'd like to kind of open it up and have all the commissioners have kind of an open discussion and continue to ask questions, and definitely share, Councilwoman Medina, if you have any questions from constituents. Otherwise, yeah, we'll kind of make it a bit of an open discussion. So let me just quickly bring up the prompt. Okay, we're looking to have a conversation with all the speakers on the commission about what the reliability of the electric grid might look like in 5 or 10 years, and what could change over those timeframes to reduce outages and improve outage response. With that in mind, it might not be as necessary to look at specific dates or areas, but we are concerned about outages that were experienced recently in many parts of Ann Arbor, and we feel that it's at the top of mind. Especially from recent storms. So that's what we shared. And why don't we have the recorded message first, and then Mike, we'll have you, just so because we have you live, we can kind of go right into the discussion from there. Does that sound okay? Great. Okay, Joe, can you play that for us?
Yep, I will share. Please let me know. I'm clicking share sound, but if it doesn't share, please let me know.
Hi, I'm Seth Geikma. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and I was asked to speak at tonight's council meeting to talk a little bit about power systems, storms, and reliability. I wish I could be there with you in person, but due to travel challenges, I am stuck in Chicago trying to get home today. So like I said, I'm Seth Geikma. I'm a professor in engineering at the University of Michigan, and a lot of my research over the past 15 to 20 years has focused on power outage forecasting and storm restoration with utilities. We've worked with a lot of the big utilities throughout the US and developed models that they use to help support their storm response planning, in particular outage forecasting. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the outage process. Why do utilities have outages? What can they do about it? What can't they do about it? Talk a little bit about restoration, and then talk about some of their longer term hardening options. So in terms of outages, for big storms, no utility can prevent all the outages. There will be outages. There's nothing they can do within reasonable cost that will prevent all of the outages. So there will be outages. So what the utility has to do is strike this cost-benefit analysis of, well, how much hardening do we do? How do we restore from those outages that we're inevitably going to have, so that we can get that right balance of cost to customers versus reliability of the system. So in the kinds of weather events we get in the Southeast Michigan area, typically wind events, winter events, ice storms like we had earlier this year, most of the outages are going to be in the distribution system. So we have the generation, transmission, and distribution. The generation is the production of the power. The transmission is the high voltage lines, typically very high, maintained to a very high standard. And then the distribution is what most of us typically see, and that's our lines to the cities and our rural areas around Ann Arbor. So this is where most of the outages are in wind events and snow events and ice events. And this is where a company like DTE has to put in a lot of effort to maintain those lines. So what causes outages? Often it's things impacting lines. So trees falling on lines is a big one. Could be debris in some cases. It could be lines themselves failing. But typically a big one is trees impacting lines, which points to one of the big things that utilities have to do to maintain the system and maintain reliability, which is tree trimming. Tree trimming is not always popular with homeowners because, well, they're trimming our trees. But this is, research has shown this is arguably the single biggest thing that utilities can do to improve the reliability of the system. That is, trim the trees more frequently and trim them farther back. So utilities have to have the leeway to do that tree trimming. And DTE has significantly improved their tree trimming over the last few years. Since a big storm we had I think it was a March storm a number of years ago. So they put a lot of effort into that tree trimming process and made some significant improvements. That's not always popular with homeowners because they're out there cutting your trees. But this has a huge impact on power system reliability. So this is one of the things they can do in advance of any storm to improve the reliability. Now let's talk a little bit about a storm that's forecast. So kind of the short term, what does the utility do? So they see a weather forecast that says, okay, we're going to have 70-mile gust wind and hail and lightning and all this other stuff, right? What can they do? Well, the decisions they have are how many crews do they have on hand to respond to that storm and where do they station them? And then to some extent material, but crews is the big one. And this is where a lot of our research has tried to help utilities of helping them plan those crew needs. So what they have to be able to do is estimate roughly how many outages are we going to have, because if they can get a number of outages, they can figure out, well, how many crews do we need, given how much work a crew can get done in a 16-hour shift, how many crews do we need to get power back on at a certain rate? So they need some way of estimating how bad it's going to be before the event. So they can get those crews in place so they're not waiting 24, 48 hours to get those crews in there to restore power. So once the outages happen, then they have to restore power. Prioritization rules vary a little bit utility to utility, but generally across the large number of utilities we work with, first is go after critical facilities, hospitals, fire stations, police stations, water pumping stations, things like that. Some utilities will then prioritize commercial areas, particularly commercial areas that have grocery stores in them. Not all utilities do that. And then the general rule is we want to get the most number of people back online as fast as we can. So if you're like me and you live in a rural area towards the end of the line, we're lower priority, which makes sense from an overall societal good. So the utilities then go through the process of restoring power, and it's a really complicated process. It costs them an immense amount of money that they then have to expend to get people's power back on. Okay, so that's kind of the short term. In the long term, utility vegetation management or tree trimming is the big thing they can do. They can also think about things to harden the system. For example, in hurricane-prone areas, one thing that some utilities like Florida Power and Light have done is replace wooden poles, some wooden poles, with concrete poles. Very, very expensive, but very effective at keeping those poles from being broken. Something else that sometimes gets mentioned is undergrounding power lines. So this is something after a really big outage that often press and politicians say, oh, we should bury everything. The challenge there is cost. The cost of undergrounding line vary tremendously, but $1 million to $2 million a line mile in relatively simple terrain is not a bad estimate. So if you think about how much line there is just in Ann Arbor or just in Washington County, this would be an immense cost. And if you then divide by the number of customers, most of us probably are not going to be willing to pay that. So undergrounding, universal undergrounding is generally cost prohibitive. Now, if you're building new construction, then the cost differential between undergrounding and building overhead isn't as big, and you see more new construction that's underground. Again, not always. So undergrounding is one of those things people talk about, but it's not a universal great solution. It only makes sense in very targeted places. As the utility goes through this whole process, there's also another party involved. Well, at least one more. And in particular, the regulators are involved. So the state regulators have a say in evaluating the performance of a utility, both in the long run and in a specific event. But then they also have a say in deciding what costs are allowable, what costs can be passed on to customers, what costs do utilities have to use. And if a utility is going to invest a lot of money in hardening a system or doing something like that, they have to get regulatory approval to do this. For example, one utility worked with on the East Coast, they were proposing $4 billion of improvements to try and protect against hurricane storm surge right after Hurricane Sandy. They don't generally have problems. They were having a hard time making that argument. So this is something that kind of overlies all of this, which is the role of the state regulators. So one other thing that I was asked to talk a little bit about is if you look at DTE versus consumers, right? Two utilities right next to each other, same state regulators, generally fairly similar weather patterns. What's the reliability look like? Well, the utilities are required to report to the state their what's called SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI numbers. We're going to talk about SAIDI and SAIFI, system average interruption frequency index and system average interruption duration index. So measures how frequently power goes out and how long it's out when it goes out. These are very imperfect measures. We've published some work on that, but that's what gets reported kind of universally. So if you look at consumers versus DTE on their latest SAIDI and SAIFI reportings, they're about the same. There's really not a distinguishable difference between those two utilities. It might seem to those of us like me that are DTE customer that things have been worse, but if you look at that ice storm we had earlier this year, it hit the DTE area a lot harder than it did the consumers area. So from a data perspective, at least what's reported publicly to the state, they're very similar. One interesting thing is that there is an upward trend in these indices over the past few years. That is, things are getting slightly worse, and it's a discernible trend. It's not like a rocket climb, but it is an upward trend. What's not clear is why. Is the weather getting more difficult? Is something else going on? It's not clear. So overall, this hopefully gives you some idea of kind of the picture around power outages. Again, most of them kind of from the weather events we have are happening in the distribution system. That utility vegetation management is the single most important thing that DTE can do to help maintain system reliability, even if it's not always popular with cities and customers. And they do have this interaction with the state that is in some sense constraining them, but it's also a partnership in figuring out how to improve this. So I hope this helps. If you have questions, you can contact me by email. I'm sgeikema@umich.edu. Thank you.
Stop sharing and just want to again say thanks. If you couldn't tell, he was recording from the airport today as his flight was significantly delayed. I know some have experienced that recently, but appreciate the effort for willing to still record in an airport. So,
Commissioner Overbeck?
Yeah, I just want to know if he's delayed by a power outage. I'm sorry.
Fantastic. Rhetorical question or no? Okay. Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing that with us. I let him know that I'm going to follow up with him. So with our minutes here and some notes that I'm taking, so I can pass all this good stuff along. Okay. Mike Witkowski, would you like to share with us what you came to say?
Yeah, so again, first of all, Mike Witkowski, one of our engineering managers here at DTE. Thank you for having us here this evening. And I guess I'll start with going through a few high-level notes, and then I'll dive into the questions that were asked. Those were some very good questions by the resident earlier. And then I'll be happy to take any questions that the council has here. So, you know, we're here to come and talk about what we've got going on the system, what the city of Ann Arbor residents, businesses have been experiencing, and you know, what we're trying to do about it. So yes, we know there are definitely areas that struggle with reliability, repeated outages. It sometimes moves around year over year, and that's kind of where you get those pockets of customers who are like, hey, I've had 2, 3, 4 outages this year, and it becomes very repetitive and very disruptive, especially a lot of people, most of us here, working and taking meetings from home. So you're noticing things a lot more than you used to, where you come home and, oh, my clocks are blinking, to easy reset. It's not the same disruption. So here at DT, we've really been attacking the reliability. It does take a little while to get the results we're looking for and you're looking for, but at a high level, there's 4 main points that we are really diving into, and the professor kind of hit on some of them for us. Number 1 really is tree trim. It is a tough thing to do. We all love our trees. I've got some good ones around me here in Livonia, and I drive around the neighborhood and they're getting into the power line. So we got to go through and trim those out. We do aim for a 5-year cycle on our tree trimming, and Ann Arbor is very close to being on that 5-year cycle. I think by the end of this year, it might be on that 5-year point. So it's actually further ahead than some other communities in that standpoint. Areas where we do complete our tree trimming do experience a 60 to 70% improvement in reliability. So that's both in terms of your number of times you go out and the length of your outage, just because you've got less occurrences. So it's a big impact in terms of a quick hit, instant result. The longer term things, you've got your maintenance programs where you go through, replace pole top equipment, do your maintenance at your substations, and keep everything in that working condition. So there's a variety of programs we have in that space. And honestly, for Ann Arbor, it does fall into the next category, which is more of rebuilds and upgrades. So we've been talking, I've talked with planning commissions and city councils here in Ann Arbor for the better part of a decade on some of the substation projects we've been working on in the city. A couple of the big ones right now, we've got continuing work at our Buckler substation, which is there at our Broadway Service Center site. That is one of those projects that is in that 4.8 to 13.2 distribution voltage bucket. That's one of actually the first one in Ann Arbor that we're working on, and I'm glad to say we're finally bringing that home here within the next, I'll say 9 to 12 months. Optimistically by end of year, but probably into next spring to work through the final conversions on that project. So when we do these projects to convert from 4.8 to 13.2, it's pretty much a wholesale replacement of the poles and wires. And when we're putting in new poles and wires, it's to today's standards. So, you know, a lot of the system in Ann Arbor is from when the community was built, you know, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So that equipment has served its purpose. It's time to get the new stuff up there, and it's the technology, the standards, the hardware is so much better than it used to be. You know, at a simple stance, Professor mentioned transitioning from wood poles to concrete poles and steel poles. We're working that in so that our most essential service lines are featuring steel poles or concrete poles. We're getting rid of wood cross arms, either going with no cross arm, where the connections are directly to the pole, or with a fiberglass cross arm. And then the insulators that the wires connect to used to just kind of be a little piece of porcelain with a ridge in it. Wire sits in there, and you kind of strap it on with a loop, and it just holds in there. The new ones are they have a metal top, and it's a clamp top, so you fit it in there, bolt it in, and it's a really strong system. So that's what Ann Arbor can expect to be seeing wherever we're doing these projects. Like I said, that Buckler one that we're working to finish up right now, we just did an area of work in the northern part of downtown. And the next wave that we're going to be working on here the rest of summer and into the fall is in the northern residential area, northwest area, like towards like Sunset and west of Main Street there. So that's project number one that is heading towards the finish line, and we're not stopping there. My engineering team has been working on a handful of other projects that we've moved into design and starting into construction. The second one is on the east side of town, actually just outside of town, at a substation at Plymouth and Dixboro. And that is going to be strengthening up that area, which will then cascade west over 23, kind of along Plymouth Road there. So it'll bring into that area and allow us to do additional upgrades there. So that one just started construction this year. Other parts of the city, we just moved out of engineering into design, similar projects at our substation called Pittsfield, which is down on, I want to say just off of Eisenhower and Burton, down in the southeast corner. So that's going to be the same thing, full rebuild of the poles and wires. And at that location, we're going to be proposing to replace the substation on site. So basically take out all the old equipment, build a new substation on that site. On the west side of town at our Hemlock substation, at kind of roughly Maple and Liberty, Same thing, replacing all the poles and wires in that area, and replacing that substation. So those two each are, like I said, just coming out of engineering, starting into design, and we're going to start to see some field construction next year on those out in the residential areas. And each of those projects will continue for several years as we work through those. And then we've got plans that we're starting for the remaining substations in town too. So it's kind of a cascading effect as you're converting this 4.8 to 13.2. You need to have 13.2 to 13.2 connections. That way you can move the load around, you can tie the circuits together. And it's not just for capacity reasons there, but it's for reliability. That way, if there is an event where a circuit goes down, you can tie it to an adjacent circuit. And that really gets into one of the last points of our plan is really looking into automation, getting into a smart grid that can perform some restorations without manual intervention. So, if you think of the circuit breaker that you've got in your basement, if you blow a fuse, you got to go downstairs, flip the switch. Sometimes there's nothing you need to fix. You just got to switch that breaker back in and it holds. You can think of the same thing on the electric grid. A lot of events, honestly, caused by trees are momentary in nature. So yes, you get the ones that bring down wires, bring down poles, and our stronger system should mitigate a good portion of those. But you do get ones where a tree limb comes down and causes two wires to contact. So that's enough to blow a fuse. But with some of the new equipment we're getting out there, it will run through those operations automatically. So you don't need that manual intervention. You don't need to go downstairs, flip your breaker, i.e. you don't need to send a line crew out to go plug a fuse. Even beyond that, the smart grid is really another level more where if, area A is out of power because there is a downed line, we're able to isolate that from our control system downtown and then reroute the power through another circuit, re-energizing as many customers as possible while we wait to make the repairs of the down wire. So those are our four main points that we're really diving into: tree trim and maintenance, kind of the combo 1-2, short-term work for a quick impact, and then our longer term plays around rebuilds, conversions, and system automation and smart grid. So that's kind of the prepared notes. Would you like me to dive into the 4 or 5 questions that were asked by the caller? Yes. Okay. So those were really good questions. And I think I started to touch on some of those a little bit. Question number 1 was around substation transformers and, our plans for more substations. Yes, we did build our new Buckler substation about 10 years ago now, like I said, at the Ann Arbor Service Center. And we did build a new station in partnership with the University of Michigan on their campus. But when you look at the rest of Ann Arbor, we've really looked at what we can do with our existing properties. So what we're looking to do is replace on site for the vast majority of them. So I'm not going to, take it off the table that we might need a new substation somewhere that we don't have one today. But the plan that we've put out there does look like we will be able to efficiently convert all of the 4.8 to 13.2, create about a level of 3x capacity as far as what Ann Arbor has now on the distribution system by just replacing the existing substations where they are. There's some other things we have if you get a large growth area somewhere, or, depending how EVs play out, what level of charger is needed throughout commercial or residential areas. There's some things we're looking to learn in that space. But the plan we've got together, like I said, about 3x capacity, and it does plan for full 4.8 to 13.2 conversion throughout the city of Ann Arbor. So no, I don't think we will need more substations at this time. But we'll kind of see how that goes a little bit. The second question was around distributed energy resources, DERs. That is definitely something that becomes a lot more feasible as you convert to 13.2, because as you've got proposed DERs, whether it's solar or storage out there, as those DER owners, whether it's us or independent customers, if they want to put power back onto the grid needs to be able to support that two-way power flow. And that is a lot more feasible with the 13.2 grid. Just comes down to voltage support, resistance of the wires. We're excited to be working with the Viridian development on their plans with solar and storage there that could support the community, as well as possibly come back onto the grid as well. So it's definitely something we are working towards. We want to learn more about and see where the industry takes us. But we're definitely ready to support the interest in that space. I talked quite a bit about 4.8 to 13.2, and that kind of lines up with our big, what we call our DGP, our distribution grid plan. That's something that we're working on with the MPSC, and that kind of looks at not just our 1 year or 5 year view, but what our 15+ year view is for the whole system. So everything I was talking about, our 4-point plan, really weaves into that DGP. Conversions is a big piece of that. Part of the question that was asked was, how it comes into play with connections to ITC, the transmission company. So at a simple terms, the ITC, they run the 120,000 volt transmission lines that connects some substations to substations. DTE also operates a sub-transmission line, which operates at 40,000 volts. And so we have some stations, actually the newest of which is either the one that we built in partnership with U of M. That's a 120 to 40 kV step down station, where ITC brings in 120. We step it down to 40, and then we provide that 40 to U of M for their distribution system. And we have a series of substations that are for U of M. On the south side of town near Briarwood is actually one of our probably most state-of-the-art substations we have right now. It's a combined station where, again, ITC brings in 120 transmission. We step it down to 40 kV subtransmission. That 40 kV subtransmission then goes out and feeds a good majority of the substations in Ann Arbor, as well as several other stations around the city. But that substation near Briarwood also has now a 120 to 13.2 connection point where we serve that Briarwood area. So yes, DTE does work with ITC on connections for substations. However, the substations that we have left in Ann Arbor are served by the 40 kV system, and we believe our upgraded or replaced substations on those sites will continue to be connected to the 40 kV system. So at this time, we don't see a need to go through the regional approval process with MISO, with ITC. So we don't see that continued or additional time lag on those projects. The projects that we have in our plan are ones that we can move forward with as we get approved through the MPSC. So we are definitely not avoiding conversion to 13.2. If anything, in Ann Arbor, we are looking at how we can expedite that. So that's always an area where we look to the community, to the leaders here, for those partnerships as we're bringing projects to the table. So we will be bringing those whenever we do substation projects or the large rebuild projects. Those go through the city approval process for permitting and all of that. So you'll be learning a lot more of that as those plans go through design process. The last question was a two-parter, and it's probably something we could talk for hours on itself, is around what we call contribution in aid of construction, or CIAC. And what that really boils down to is the question was why we are charging some developers for capacity. And what it comes down to is, if customer one wants to add some load and it creates an overload or projected overload on our system, that customer is responsible to help us mitigate that. If they don't contribute CIAC, then that cost is pretty much goes into the rate base and will be absorbed by all ratepayers. So if you look at it at a wider scale, just like we can't charge customers in Ann Arbor higher on their bill, or customers across the board, but customers in Ann Arbor for this purpose higher because we're supporting work for the Gordie Howe Bridge. That the large projects have to contribute some CIAC into that contribution, or otherwise it goes across all the ratepayers. So we're not double charging or double making profits on any of that. It's basically whatever a developer pays into a project is less money that we ask for in our rate cases. So there's no additional funding there. So that's kind of the short answers to those. I know I kind of talked for a while, but definitely open to any questions the council has, and go from there.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was a really thorough discussion, and I'm so happy you shared all that. I wanted to ask you just briefly before we open it up, hearing your kind of 4 strategies here, both long-term and short-term, to ease some of the reliability issues. Can you just speak to sort of like 5, 10, and 15 years? I know that the distribution grid plan is coming out, but and also hearing that we're kind of like towards the 5-year end of the cycle for tree trimming. Like within 5 years, what maybe projects do you see completed? And what kind of results? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but like maybe a short response, because I would like to open it up. But do you see what I mean? Like, just give us a sense for your 4 approaches to improve reliability. What are the timelines for those?
Yeah, so the tree trim and your standard maintenance, those are going to be ongoing. So customers can expect that every 5 years we're going through trimming trees. And the biggest change over the last decade has been kind of changing our tree trim standards, which, unfortunately in some situations does mean trimming a little bit wider away from the wires. Our new equipment, like we said, when we can go to armless, we're bringing those wires closer to the pole so we can bring that trim radius along with us. But yeah, tree trim and your standard pole top or equipment maintenance, whether it's on poles or at substations, those are going to be ongoing. Your biggest ones, like I said, are going to be the conversions, your rebuilds, which feeds into reliability, feeds into capacity, and then enables the automation. So what I would say in the next 5 years, we'll have, obviously the Buckler substation project will be wrapping up within the next year or less. So that's one big piece there for the kind of northern part of the city. And then those other three that I mentioned that are out of engineering now on the northeast side, southeast side, and west side. Those projects, when you look at them, they're about $40 to $60 million a piece. So it does take several years to work through those, both in terms of the sheer number of pole and wire replacements you have to do. We are definitely pursuing underground opportunities where it makes sense. And, so that doesn't mean that in all the residential areas, we're going to take the stuff that's in the backyards and put it underground. We can talk about that at another time at length. There's a lot of pros and cons to that. But what it does mean is we're looking at opportunities where it does make sense to get some of the core infrastructure. The most important piece is get those underground. So, sometimes where it's along main roads or, in really bad tree areas, we're looking at those opportunities. So it's definitely something that we are very interested all the way at our executive level. And then you have the substation parts of those projects. So they take a little while to go through those. But I would say in the 5 years, you should kind of start to see that perimeter of the 4.8 to 13.2 conversion start to come into the city. And then in the 5 to 10 year range would be the next core of substations, working through those. So that's kind of where we're at. I think, City of Ann Arbor, we're probably in the 10 to 15 year range for full conversion. And like I said, we're looking for opportunities to bring that in at every opportunity.
Great, thanks for breaking that down for us. Okay, I'd like to open the conversation up for anyone who would like to share and ask questions. Bless your heart.
I thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I appreciate the attention to detail on a lot of the issues from both speakers. One of the questions I had with respect to DT is I know recently that there is this sort of longer term plan that's been laid out, and we're speaking to that. I'm sort of wondering what it looks like also beyond the 15 to 20 year time frame, in part because I think as we look back in some of the news reports, there's quite a bit of talk about how old a lot of the infrastructure is and how it's needed updating. And sort of, I'm wondering if you're able to speak at all to sort of what that looks like now moving forward. I'm really appreciative of the sort of 15 to 20 year time frame as the sort of outward look, but then what does it look like as we sort of shift our time frame forward? Are we thinking about 15 to 20 year timeframes now every year moving forward, or are you thinking on a longer term scale? How is DTE thinking about that sort of longer term vision beyond even just this current sort of planning cycle?
That's a good question. It's tough because right now there's so much excitement here on the engineering team about having this opportunity to rebuild the grid. And at the tail end of this 10 to 15 year window here, Ann Arbor is probably going to have one of the newest distribution systems in the country. We're doing it throughout our whole territory. And honestly, Detroit and Ann Arbor have been a big focus of our conversion efforts. So, Ann Arbor's quite a bit smaller than Detroit's footprint. So we're going to get through that, I think, in a decent amount of time here. And beyond that, it's really going to be wherever the industry goes. Back to the question of DERs, solar and storage, I think, are going to be big components. Different opportunities for that smart grid and automation that we're really pushing for. That's something we we're looking to get a lot more here in the immediate future, the next 5 years as well. So all of those things combined, I think, is going to be a very dramatically different grid than you're used to today in terms of reliability and resiliency, and like how the grid can react to those issues. Because a lot of things we're seeing ice or trees, and a lot of the trees that are coming down, gotta say, it's a lot of them are, despite what we trim, it's a large tree from outside of our easement, and those are always tough. But if something goes wrong at a substation or something like that, we're building a grid that can absorb those contingencies without overbuilding as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Murski.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation, and also thank you to Professor Glickma. I am hoping that Mr. Witowski, you're able to answer something that the professor addressed. He indicated that utilities evaluate cost and benefits when deciding how to upgrade for reliability purposes. I'm wondering if there is a clear understanding and definition, for example, imposed by the MPSC or maybe some type of association on how that is evaluated, and what are the costs and what are the benefits that are included. I've been impacted several times in the last year by outages. And the last time just recently, 3 weeks or so ago, I lost power for 2 days. In spite of buying ice, we lost a lot of things in our freezer, some of which we were able to consume, some of which we couldn't. So I'm really wondering, when he says utilities evaluate costs and benefits, how is that done? And is DTE do it the same way that consumers does, or that Duke Power does, or PG&E? How is this evaluation done?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we do work with the MPSC very closely on that. We have what we call a GPM, or a global priority model, where all of the projects that our engineers are proposing are put into the model and scored based on a variety of categories. Benefits could include safety impact, outage impact, frequency, duration, risk of what the event could be. Kind of like the professor mentioned in terms of like storm outages or restoration strategy. Is an event at a site going to affect 1,000 customers or 100 customers? Is it going to affect a hospital or a public service like a water station, something like that? So it is an endless amount of variables that weigh into that benefit side of the equation. But we've done a lot of work, a lot of discussions with the MPSC, and we do have I think pretty good support for our push to convert the 4.8 system. And that's where a lot of our dollars are going long term. And that's what's now driving a lot of that investment into the city of Ann Arbor, between that and like I said, some of the newer technologies around automation. We're doing pilots with microgrids, really doing a lot of things in Ann Arbor now that we weren't approved for in the past.
I have a couple of other questions, if I may. The professor also mentioned 2 standard metrics that are used. I didn't get those exactly, but I I have a more general question, and that is DTE has a service monopoly that's granted to service customers in a region, including residents, industry, etc. I'm wondering what level of performance transparency there is that DT has, for example, on these two metrics, overall for its entire service area, as well as by jurisdiction, that anyone like myself or a customer that pays $1 billion a year for power to DTE, where can they access information on DTE performance? And similarly, you gave a lot of anecdotal information. Well, first, let me finish the first thought. So what I would love to see, I don't know if this is possible, but this is something that we're talking about also for the city, is performance means what are the trends over time? How do those trends compare to goals that have been set in the past? What are the goals for the future? And how does your performance compare to benchmarks? CMS was mentioned as one benchmark, but there's clearly probably other benchmarks. And without that, you can talk a lot about where we're looking for opportunities, and you can list 15 different projects and things like that. But without really seeing what the outcomes are, it's difficult for us to understand what those are. So I'm wondering what is being done in that regard.
Yeah, I'm getting some additional support here from one of my VPs. So yes. So the two metrics that he mentioned are SAFE and SAIDI. Real simple way to look at those: SAFE is frequency, SAIDI is duration. So
if I may, neither one of those, as I understand it, and the way he has described it as well, includes a factor or a multiplier indicating the number of residents impacted or the number of businesses or anything like that, right? Neither one of those really includes an impact.
Yeah, those actually would include the whole system, or an aggregate. So when you look at the duration piece, Katie with a C would be an individual customer. So you would have a Katie.
Okay.
Actually, everybody on this call would have a Katie. That's how long you were out for a year, or whatever the period of time is, if you wanted to aggregate wider. When you put those all together, that becomes the SAIDI, the system average. So, but again, at their cores, SAFE frequency, SAIDI duration.
Right.
When you look at the DTE system as a whole, I don't have the numbers up here, but and I'm not going to pretend to make them up. But our SAFE on average is usually fairly good. There are definitely pockets where customers experience a high frequency of events in a year. I'm with you right now. I've had 3, including the 2 during the ice storm and 1 2 weeks ago. So, right now, nobody's immune to it, even though we're focusing on it. Duration, that is an area where we are underperforming some of the other peer utilities, and that really goes to our focus around the automation space and that smart grid space.
And where can the general public access that information? Is it on a DTE webpage? Is it through the MPSC? How is that reported?
Yep. So we do report it to the MPSC. I don't know if it is published on our website. It looks like it is starting the first quarter of this year. It's reported on the MPSC website. And it was initially reported as an aggregate system total. Now it is published by zip code, and it is now reported quarterly. So, like you said, the data, we got to get that visible. And that's something that the MPSC has requested. So it's out there, and we're definitely willing to come meet and talk again more about any specific Ann Arbor issues for sure.
The other thing that you did is you ticked off a number of different projects. I'm wondering if there is again, a web page, public-facing web page where that kind of information is available. I'll give you an example of what the city of Ann Arbor does. It has a web page. You could take a look at it. The city of Ann Arbor pavement condition page, and you can go and you can see what the average pavement condition is in Ann Arbor. You can look at the pavement condition for individual streets. You can click on those streets and you can get information that indicates when those are on the schedule to be paved, resurfaced, whatever the case may be. It would be wonderful if that kind of information was out there again for us so that we could understand what is DTE doing other than just sort of anecdotal and a list of projects information from you. And so that we would be able to plan accordingly with any projects that might be impacted by that here. Is anything like that available?
Yeah, so you actually also brought up something that I'll touch on too. Yes, there is a map that is available. It's pretty high level, but it is available to the public, so we can share that link with you. The DGP, the distribution grid plan, is also posted on the MPSC website. I think the prior version might be over 100 pages. And the new one, we're trying to slim down a little bit, but it is a good read. One thing you mentioned is, really looking for, I think, partnerships with communities where you're doing projects, where you might be doing a road project, how, that may overlay with the work we need to do. So that's something that we're definitely interested in, having those discussions and seeing where those overlay, and there could be significant cost savings for all parties. So I don't know if you intended to spark that thought, but you brought that up.
Good. I have several other questions, but I'll yield the floor because I don't know how much more time we want to devote to this. I'll just let you know that there's a lot of interest from the general public. I had 2 people text me with questions, and I really didn't get to either one of them. I mean, one of them was simply, we pay high rates, higher than the average in the Midwest, and why doesn't DTE simply hire more people and accelerate the conversion from 4.8 to 13.2, not only here, but also in underserved areas in Detroit. As you're probably aware, there's been analyses done on that, but you don't have to answer that question. I mean, there's a lot of other questions that the community has on this topic, as you might imagine.
Yep.
Thanks, Commissioner Morosky. Yeah, I'd like to gather those, actually, Commissioner Morosky, if you could share them maybe with Joe, and we can get them on the meeting minutes, because I'd like to start compiling a list. And I think that tracking this along with the documents and the kind of public resources that were shared around reliability are super important. I have a similar experience of just having friends, contact me and ask specific questions, and that's where some of the motivation came for my questions. So I think as a community, we all are tracking this individually, and it makes a lot of sense to kind of get together and make sure that our voices are heard. So thanks, Commissioner Mirsky. Council Member Regina, are you ready to share?
Thanks. I also have a number of questions, and so I'm gonna try to keep them relatively focused to kind of your area, Mr. Witowski, because I know that not everything that I have would necessarily probably be best directed to you, but specifically on some of the grid capacity. You touched on this briefly, and I guess I wanted to dig in a little bit more around exactly where where the challenge is, particularly when we have new builds in the area that are going to create a capacity issue, and one of the frustrations that I think continues to be bubbling up seemingly more and more, and particularly as Ann Arbor is working quickly to address our housing crisis and our affordability crisis, is that we will have a new proposal for an apartment complex, a multiple unit housing complex that's willing to come in. And I'm hearing consistently from the developer on that project that hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million+ of grid improvements are being requested from DTE in order to, in their view, have the benefit of then paying you for the power that they're going to use as well. And so I know you mentioned it's not really double dipping, but they are. I mean, they're essentially paying you to put in the infrastructure to pay you for the product. And I guess I'm wondering, I heard your explanation around spreading that across ratepayers would be the alternative. I've heard mixed things about where the holdup on that is. You know, I would actually challenge a little bit. I mean, when we're hearing that this is adding hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million+ to every new housing development that's coming in, that makes every one of those units even less affordable for our community. And so that challenge is also exacerbating our affordability crisis here. And so I guess I'm trying to understand a little bit more about what goes into that decision, what goes into that cost, and why there is such a heavy burden for kind of the last in to make up for really the additional grid capacity that's needed.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, we could talk on this for hours. I actually kind of do lead our CIAC policy around this, and we're always, anything that we charge a customer to contribute towards a project is always the minimum standard. So we're not going to charge them to rebuild miles and miles because it's something we want to do. We're going to charge the minimum of what it takes to serve their development. Oftentimes, we do opt to invest beyond that to continue those upgrades to set up for some additional projects. So we are looking for those opportunities. You know, I would definitely be interested in talking with you further on this. I haven't seen one lately that has been in the $1 million range, but there very well may have been. Some of the most challenging projects actually are downtown Ann Arbor. Some of the ones I'm thinking of right now are actually more relocation based versus capacity based. So if we have to move lines, put them underground, those downtown underground builds are especially expensive. Putting in the conduit and the cable and replicating an overhead system with switching opportunities, it can be quite expensive. So that might be some of those most expensive ones. Yeah, as we continue these conversion projects, a lot of the capacity will be there. So, you know, I guess I'm not giving you a brief and brilliant answer to that because there's many layers to it. But CIC is a policy at the MPSC level. So that's, you know, we're working through that requirement and looking to be as efficient with those costs to the developers as absolutely possible. And the biggest thing we really do encourage developers to do is, as soon as they're thinking about a project, start talking to us. Because sometimes that means we can, you know, look at what we've got in our plans. Sometimes that means putting their electrical room on the west side of the building versus the east side of the building. Because sometimes the difference of a block can mean capacity is there or it isn't. So getting those early discussions, you know, we can really be a partner in this and, make sure capacity is there when customers need it.
Yeah, I appreciate the offer to continue that conversation as well, because this is something that's coming up more and more frequently. And particularly as we're trying to expedite the increase of housing stock in the community. I've also heard kind of a much smaller level, luckily, impact on kind of a housing commission project that we have there. It's even, more impactful when we're trying to build specifically affordable units. And so I would very much appreciate a continued conversation on that. And if it's something that needs to be addressed at the MPSC level, I think that's a conversation worth having.
Yeah.
Also, a bit on infrastructure, and I don't know if this is outside of your scope, is on the actual technology that DTE is using itself, the outage map in particular. I've consistently heard from folks about kind of the inaccuracy around the outage map. Sometimes the outage map itself is out. And then also, I think what I've been hearing a bit more frequently from constituents is reports on the outage map that they're back on, that their power is back on. When they are not back on, they have to resubmit a report and then feel like they're starting all over again in the process. And so that comes down to a bit of the public trust issue, but also around the reliability concerns is that I get the question, does DT even know which power is on and which power is off during these major outages? So I don't know if you can address kind of some of the reliability of the outage map itself.
I can't really speak to the outage map itself. I will say we hear those concerns, and the team is definitely looking into modifications to make those improvements. The second piece that you touched on is a very frequent thing that we hear from customers. And, as I'm downtown working on the storm teams, that's a big challenge that we look at. So it's this whole concept of trouble behind trouble. And if you take the simple form of it, let's say a whole circuit is out, 1,000 customers. And that's on day one. We roll out there because that's the biggest job we've got out on the system. We're going to send a crew out there, get that wire back up on the poles, and think that we restored that 1,000 customers. What happens a lot of times is there may be a fuse section, a smaller section, 50 customers, 100 customers towards the end of the circuit. Well, there's a wire down and a blown fuse there too. So what has to kind of happen is that first event gets fixed, and then another event gets created for that smaller event. And when you look at the whole restoration strategy that you employ during a storm, just like the professor mentioned, you're trying to hit your critical services, but you're also trying to get as many customers back as soon as possible. The way that plays out is sometimes those customers get a response that says, "Hey, congratulations, your power's been restored." No, it hasn't. You're still out. It's very frustrating. So that is something we have a lot of attention on, trying to figure out how to manage that, and both in terms of the operational side, but as well in terms of the messaging side. So we definitely hear that, and we're trying to get an answer on how to fix that situation.
I also heard you mention that kind of over the next 10 to 15 year period that with the plans, Ann Arbor will have one of the kind of most upgraded parts of the grid. I hear that as kind of an elected official with, 10 to 15 years, particularly the type of year we had this year. It's not super encouraging to me. And I actually want to challenge something a little bit that you didn't say, actually, the professor said, but I think is worth discussing here. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about DTE's plans. I'm grateful to hear that you're now open to the possibility of working with the city and potentially burying lines when we're doing existing road work. That's something that Councilmember Briggs and I actually brought up in a conversation with DTE in our first term, or the first half of our term 2 years ago. And at the time, it was not an interest area. So I'm glad to hear that that's shifting. But I do want to challenge a little bit on the notion that undergrounding lines is cost prohibitive. And I want to preface that with, I know that the data is the study could be updated to use current data, but there's a FEMA study out there that was looking at the fact that two major storm events essentially pays for undergrounding a line, the costs that go into that. I'm sure that it's potentially 3 or 4 now by today's costs. But I look at, last year, the last several years, DTE averaged almost $1 billion in profits. If we accept that it costs $1 million a mile to bury lines, every year for the next 10 years, we could be burying 1,000 miles of line every year. So, and not only, does that seem to make good business sense in the long run for me, but for my constituents, the people in Ann Arbor, the people in Ypsilanti, the people throughout Southeast Michigan, why is that not the best investment that DTE could be making in terms of the astronomical costs? Every household that has to throw away an entire refrigerator of food, every household that has to get into a hotel room because it's freezing, those costs are being borne by the community already. And so I guess, why shouldn't we expect that DTE should be looking at making the most reliable grid possible when they are reporting $1 billion in profit every year?
Yeah, so on the underground piece, like I said, we're definitely open to it. We have a variety of pilot projects that we're looking to see where we can make cost improvements on that. And if we are successful in those pilots, it is something we hope we can bring to scale in a lot wider areas. So all the projects I mentioned for Ann Arbor, like I said, we are looking at underground at the simple level. It's taking more underground from the substations. Like I said, for those core parts of the circuit, what we would call like a backbone that impacts the largest number of customers. We're looking to extend that underground. How we bring that into the residential areas, there are challenges there in terms of easements, where to put transformers, putting underground lines in a residential area could have almost a more detrimental impact to trees depending on where the roots are. But that's not everywhere. So we are going to look for those opportunities. And I think definitely looking where there are road projects are some of those maybe, more optimistic opportunities where there's some cost benefit. So yes, it's something where, I was in a meeting proposing a project just a couple of weeks ago with our president, and we said, we want to put overhead here, and he's ticking off on the side, here's 2 miles of missed underground opportunity. So it is high focus all the way to the top. So it's something we're looking to do, and looking to improve our cost on that.
Sorry. I think the last question that I have that I'll ask right now before I cede the floor for a minute for others, because I know that I have opportunities to talk to other folks at DTE more regularly. I guess this maybe goes a little bit towards the question that John was asking about benchmarking and some of the DTE has relatively reliably, at least in recent times, been one of the worst in the country in terms of the frequency with which there are outages or shutoffs. I don't believe that we have kind of the worst situation in terms of trees or storms. And so I guess I'm wondering if DT has been analyzing, like, how did we get here? I mean, I think I maybe know that I personally feel maybe we have not invested enough in the infrastructure improvements that have been needed over the years. But is DTE acknowledging how we got here to make sure that, you know, I hear 10 to 15 years, Ann Arbor is going to have the best grid, but then 10 to 15 years after that, will we be back in the same place again? And I guess I just would like to be able to understand how we can trust that DTE is not only going to upgrade the grid now because there's a bit of pressure on them from Ann Arbor as we explore our opportunities and our alternatives, but that this is something that we can count on into the future. And I just don't know that I have that confidence. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about what DTE is doing in terms of benchmarking and making sure that where we are right now is not the future.
Yeah, you know, the short answer to that is yes, we do a lot of benchmarking both with Midwest utilities, you know, looking to utilities in the South that face hurricanes. You know, we don't get hurricanes, but you know, we've had some pretty strong winds more frequently than we would have expected recently. So, you know, looking to see what is successful in those areas. We're also part of a variety of industry groups. One of them being EPRI, who does a lot of studies and different benchmarking type efforts across the whole country and even outside of the country. So we're looking to those. That's where we're getting some of the new equipment that we're bringing in. So how we can employ those the distributed resources, like I said, solar storage, wind, and using those into that microgrid space. That's something really exciting that we're just starting to get into. So those are the things we look at. And yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. You know, what happens at the end once Ann Arbor's got one of the newest in the country. You know, like I said, it's going to depend where really the industry goes, what the usage goes. You know, how we got here is a long story. We can definitely come back and talk with that another time. There's a lot of variables into that. You know, when you look at population shifts over in Michigan over the years, and how that factors into you know, the rate plans and everything. So a lot of things that we can definitely come back and talk more on, because it's a good question.
Chair McKenna, if I could, I actually looked down and I do have one more question. I focused all of mine on so far largely on grid reliability and improvements. One of the other pieces is around, as you're making these upgrades, I don't believe I heard in the 4 bullet points any conversation around transition to renewables, and I guess I would like to hear if you can answer a little bit more about the plan. You know, DTE's transition to carbon neutrality lags behind even consumers here in the state. As we're looking to our own 2030 climate goals here in the city, what are the plans as these upgrades are going in, not to just put, you know, concrete posts, but to actually make sure that the power that's flowing through them is with cleaner and clean renewable energy? Because I think it's worth acknowledging that as we see increasing storm severity, that our power companies own some of the responsibility for that, because they continue to rely mostly on fossil fuels.
Yep. So great question. That is not my specialty, but I did get some notes. So yes, we've spent this whole time talking about the distribution system within Ann Arbor. We did just have a great outcome with our what we call the IRP, Integrated Resource Plan. where we actually brought down or actually sped up the transition away from coal. And I believe it's, I wrote that down, now projecting to be off of coal by 2032. So the prior was in the later 2030s, and we put together a plan to bring that in. A large piece of that does come from the renewable space, solar, and really important is going to be storage, such that you can manage those peak periods and the overnight time. So there's a lot in that IRP. If you haven't seen it, we can get you a copy of what we shared with the MPSC. And like I said, that just got approved by the MPSC a couple of weeks ago. And it's something that a lot of people are really excited about.
Great. Mr. Witkowski, just a couple of closing comments here. I'd like you to come back and share your analysis of essentially how we got here. I think Councilmember Medina had a really important point there in terms of trust and just the kind of Ann Arbor's experience, not only with our own power reliability and the repercussions that we bear the costs of, of course, including food, hotel stays, appliances, and such that have been ruined. But also when we think about development and housing, I mean, the costs borne by developers are not just, maybe the idea of double dipping, but also the fact that, how can we trust that in fact the system hasn't been underinvested in over the course of the last century and kind of is getting us where we are today. And so, it's just seeing how the housing crisis kind of overlaps a bit of a Venn diagram with what's happening with the distribution system. I think it's pretty tragic. Anyway, I'd like to definitely take you up on the offer to talk further about your analysis of that history. And if that's you or somebody else, we'd love to invite that person as well. So I'll follow up with you on that. We can have you come a little bit later in the year. Okay. Any other final comments before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. All right. Mr. Witkowski, thank you so much for joining us. And we really enjoyed your time with us.
Yep. Thanks again for all the time and really good questions. We're excited to bring these improvements to Ann Arbor. I know I've been working on them my whole time here, so excited to get them going and hopefully get them sped up, and look forward to seeing this group again sometime soon.
Thanks.
Take care.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to move on to our next agenda item. That is our presentation, Ann Arbor's presentation of the 2022 greenhouse gas inventory. So if we have Thea on the line. Hi, Thea. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. I'll let you take it away.
Perfect. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see those slides all right? Sweet, I saw a hands up. Well, okay, I'll get started then. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. For those of you who don't know, my name is Thea Jägerlener. I'm a senior energy analyst with the City of Ann Arbor's Office of Sustainability and Innovation. Every year, I complete a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory for the City of Ann Arbor. And I'm excited to be here today to present an update on the 2022 calendar year greenhouse gas inventory. So to get started, just some brief background and notes on this. As I mentioned, I estimate the greenhouse gas inventory on an annual basis. Very rarely is there data available specifically for the City of Ann Arbor for exactly what we're looking for. So a lot of this data is aggregated, scaled, or modeled. Just as a caveat as we look at it, I follow the ICLEI US community protocol when I put together the greenhouse gas inventory. I am sharing it today with you all, but I also report it on an annual basis to the CDP, which used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project. which helps fulfill some commitments the city of Ann Arbor has made in terms of climate action. And so by following a standard protocol, it means our inventory can be relatively easily compared to those of other cities. This inventory currently includes 3 greenhouse gases, CO2, N2O, and CH4, which is methane, and it factors in the global warming potentials of each. One last comment on the scope of this. So this really looks at the emissions of the community as a whole. If anyone on here or listening to this presentation really wants to know what your household emissions inventory looks like, I just want to direct you all to a good resource, which is the Cool Climate Calculator offered by Berkeley, which is great for estimating individual carbon footprints. So with that, I'll get into some data. So I do not two different inventories, but 2 scales of inventories. The first I'll call the simple inventory. This allows comparison to the inventory baseline of the year 2000. We now have more data than was available in 2000. So about halfway through this presentation, I'll switch over to talking about more emission sources that we can report on. But this lets us look at our changes over the last 23 years. So since the year 2000, by 2019, we had a 25% reduction in emission levels. I'm stopping at 2019 here for this graph because once we hit 2020 and impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, emissions year to year start looking a little bit different. And I like to talk through those individually. And so where do we see those changes happening from 2000 to 2019? Those are primarily in our buildings and in transportation, and honestly, primarily in the carbon intensity per unit of being a little bit better. So I think from 2000 to 2019, we actually used more energy in Ann Arbor, but the carbon intensity of that electricity decreased. Here I have commercial and institutional buildings lumped together. Since from 2000 to 2019, U of M acquired a lot of buildings. It's kind of tricky to try and keep them separate. So they're combined here. And then some efficiency improvements in vehicles as well. So 25% decrease, from 2000 to 2019. So as I mentioned, that was the simple inventory, which looks at comparing data sources that we also have comparable data for the year 2000. But there are also important emission sources, I think, that are important to include as I kind of dig more into more details. So this table kind of summarizes it. A lot of these are fairly small in scale. The largest impact is those of commuting of passenger vehicles and kind of out of boundary transportation trips. So the numbers from the previous slides will be smaller than what I talk about going forward. But I, again, cannot compare to 2000. So this is our expanded inventory since 2015. As I said, I complete the inventory every year. And I want to talk through a few general trends here before I dig into why things are happening and where we're seeing things. So the simple inventory, I stopped at 2019. And that was because 2020 was a pretty anomalous year with the COVID-19 pandemic, with folks both staying from home and we having less transportation trips, as well as buildings being unoccupied, occupancy patterns for buildings looking incredibly different. We saw a significant dip in emissions in 2020. By 2021, we started to see vehicle miles traveled come back up again. And by last year, 2022, we're only about a fraction lower, or a really small percentage lower than where we were in 2019 pre-pandemic. And so I want to dig into kind of like, where are we seeing these changes? Some of them are expected, I think, from recovering from the pandemic, and some of them I think are a little bit less expected. So just to quickly illustrate the The darker blue line here is the simple inventory that I was talking about. The lighter blue line is the expanded inventory with additional emission sources that increase those numbers up. And then this dashed line here is showing a really simple trajectory to carbon neutrality by 2030, which we can now see is quite a dramatic line, and we certainly have a lot of work to do. Okay, so in 2022, where did emissions come from? 21% from residential buildings, 15% from commercial buildings, and then 29% from institutional buildings. This is, by institutional, I mean the University of Michigan. 3% upstream, 17% from local transportation. So that's transportation occurring within the boundaries of Ann Arbor, 12% from commuting, and then 3% from solid waste and wastewater. So we still see buildings being the primary emission source, with transportation following secondary. And how has that looked year over year? Again, so I have another chart kind of breaking this out a little bit more, but the two sources that we've kind of seen big changes in year over year has been electricity and in vehicle fuel. Electricity, one, we saw occupancy patterns change a little bit. I'll also dig into some changes in the DT's fuel mix and carbon intensity, which has had an impact on emissions as well. And then the vehicle fuel emissions has largely been driven by vehicles miles traveled, which we saw a huge decrease in 2020, an increase in 2021, and pretty close to pre-pandemic levels by last year. So I broke out before kind of like the sectors where emissions came from. This is a chart showing where the sources of emissions come from. So 39% from electricity, 28% from natural gas, and 28% from vehicle fuel. I also include some upstream emissions here as well. I wanted to make a brief note here that the upstream emissions for natural gas include those that DTE cites for their estimated methane fugitive emissions in their system. I would recommend, and it's something that we consider when we look at specific calculations, not necessarily for the inventory, but maybe comparing a type of appliance that uses natural gas versus electricity. So natural gas can have a lot of fugitive methane emissions associated with it. The estimates for that have a wide range of values. The inventory, it's hard to present a range of those constantly. So I would, for specific calculations, it can be useful to pull out and look at that range of values for comparing lifetime emissions for certain fuels. So I hope that makes sense. Oops. So from 2020 to 2022, again, emissions have increased year over year. Where have we seen those emissions increases? Primarily in electricity and in transportation. Electricity has been both in an increase in consumption as well as an increase in carbon intensity, and then transportation, largely an increase in consumption or vehicles miles traveled. Cool. So I'm going to run through a few sectors and talk about some changes that have happened recently in the last few years. So emissions from our residential buildings. So this is our homes, the multifamily. These come from electricity, natural gas, and a little bit of propane fuel that we estimate people consume. In 2022, since the last year, electricity consumption was actually down about 3%, with natural gas consumption up about 7%. The reason why we see this is because residential energy consumption is actually pretty closely tied to weather and temperature. So this is the heating degree days compared to how much natural gas residential buildings have consumed over the last few years. The scales on the side are a little bit bogus, but I just kind of wanted to show overall trends, how closely correlated these are. So a heating degree day represents how cold it is. The more heating degree days in a year, the more heat people are using, or the more you have to heat to be comfortable. So we see, again, from 2021 to 2022, that increase in degree days that correlates to an increase in natural gas consumption. Following for the inverse, so cooling degree days, the number of an estimate for like how much we have to cool our buildings to stay comfortable compared to how much electricity consumed are also fairly correlated. So we see a decrease from 2021 to 2022, which we also saw reflected in consumption. I have included this here. I will caveat this by saying that DT has not provided data for commercial buildings for the last few years. So commercial building energy consumption is currently a really rough estimate based off of what previous years have looked like. We are currently waiting on some MPSC rulings on data access to local governments, to academic institutions, to just the general public, and hoping that we can get aggregated commercial data again in the near future. But again, that is contingent on an MPSC ruling that's still ongoing. We do have really accurate data from the University of Michigan. So the University of Michigan completes also an annual greenhouse gas inventory. I will caveat they do theirs on a fiscal year, so it can kind of lag in a weird way, but in general is useful to include. The University of Michigan used both a 3% increase in electricity and a 2% increase in CCF, which of natural gas, which combined with kind of a higher intensity grid resulted in increased emissions from 2021 to 2022. And so I'd like to dig into what I've been talking about a little bit with increased emissions. So this is DT's fuel mix since 2015. The way DT presents their fuel mix is one, the percentage of sources of electricity that they produce, but they also share the carbon intensity of fossil fuel produced electricity as well. So the two factors that are important here are, one, the percentage of electricity that comes from fossil fuels. In this chart, that's represented by oil, coal, and natural gas. And then combined with that is the carbon intensity of that production. So from year to year, sometimes the carbon intensity of just generating that electricity is better or worse than previous years. In the case of 2022, we see one, so this top or this middle blue line represented by natural gas, we can see from 2021 to 2022, an increase in the total fuel mix represented by fossil fuel. In addition, the carbon intensity also increased. The result of this is an 11% increase in the overall carbon intensity of electricity from 2021 to 2022, which is one of the primary drivers for emissions increases that we're seeing. Overall, we've seen a 7% decrease since 2015. But I just want to kind of explain why we've seen an increase in emissions the last couple of years. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to explain this as well as I can, but I understand that it's a little bit confusing. I shared earlier that I can complete the greenhouse gas inventory following this specific protocol, which the protocol doesn't let you account for things like voluntary green power purchases, things like RECs, things like offsets. The intention of the inventory is that we could, using a regional example for Washtenaw County, we could add up Ann Arbor's and Ypsilanti and the townships, and we could get a complete inventory for Washtenaw County. So what that means is in the scope of inventories, it ends up being double counting. If Ann Arbor accounts for renewable energy that's being produced somewhere else, but that's being reported on that region's eGrid numbers. However, Ann Arbor also has a 100% renewable energy goal, and I think it's still important to look at what percent is coming from renewable energy, even if it can't be directly attributed to the specific generation that Ann Arbor pulls from. So this chart here represents, the chart on the left represents the total electricity consumption in Ann Arbor from last year and the sources of green power purchases that it's attributed to. So the dark blue section shows just total non-renewable energy. This is an order of scale. U of M now makes, so GP in these charts stands for green power purchases. U of M now makes significant green power purchases. It's actually larger, almost larger in scale than DT's renewables percentage in total. DT has about 13% renewables in their fuel mix. DT has an additional 2% to reach their 15% state renewable portfolio standard mandate. And then there is also residential and commercial participation in green power purchases as well that we know of. So in total, that's about 29% of the total electricity consumption that can be attributed to renewable energy. Again, this is not reflected in the inventory numbers that I report on, but this chart on the right does, which drops the total emissions down to about 1.92. So I just wanted to do my best to explain renewable green power purchases that are happening as well. Okay. The last sector I wanted to talk about was transportation. So again, we have seen this big dip in 2020. Again, I think everyone can remember standing out and seeing empty roads, which increased in 2021, and we are almost back up to 2019 levels last year. So again, this is our vehicle miles traveled, specifically these are kilometers, which you can kind of see is the pretty much direct trend that we see in VMT or in emissions. So the primary driver for that emissions trends is the amount of miles traveled. I will continue to say that one of the easiest ways to reduce emissions is by simply not driving. We have a lot of commuting in Ann Arbor. In 2020, just having less commuting in general was incredibly impactful, and continuing to support working from home policies or enabling less commuting in general can be really, really impactful. So this data is actually from a recently available data source called the Google Environmental Insights Explorer. So they use everyone's phone data, anonymized and aggregated based on where you're going and how fast you're traveling. And they're able to estimate and aggregate and scale to incredibly high accuracy compared to other data sources, year-to-year vehicle miles traveled. They're also able to estimate trips and miles traveled on foot, on bus, and on bike based on those patterns as well. So I just wanted to share kind of this interesting tidbit. This is for in-boundary trips. So this is not representing miles traveled, but the number of trips taken. And this is only showing in-boundary trips. So trips that are within the boundary of Ann Arbor. So this doesn't include any trips coming into Ann Arbor or any trips going outside of Ann Arbor. So I want to make that scale really, really clear. And so you can kind of see that light green bar of busing essentially disappearing in 2020 and coming back again over the last couple of years. But I just wanted to point this out. HU0 has a goal of 50% of trips within the city of Ann Arbor being done by non-motorized and public transit. And we're about 8% shy of that goal. Based on this data, it's hard data to track and find a good data source for, but this is one of them, and hopefully provides some interesting context. Great. So that was the inventory. I'll pause for seconds in a second, or pause for questions in a second, but I wanted to share some interesting or some new tools available out there. One, we now have a OSI performance metrics dashboard out. This is on the city administrator's page. I would say the easiest way to find this right now is to Google OSI metrics dashboard, and you should get there. But one thing I wanted to share, this is just a screenshot I took a while ago. 2022 data is now available on there as well. But these are interactive charts. So you can hover over and see the specific numbers of sectors. You can select and deselect sectors. So if you want to see the greenhouse gas inventory, let's say without U of M in it, or you only want to see what natural gas looks like and vehicle fuel, this allows for anyone to kind of customize how they want to look and evaluate the greenhouse gas inventory. Another resource I wanted to share is the OSI's Community Greenhouse Gas Inventory page. On there, I post similar recordings year to year of this presentation. I also have on there annual reports and a guide to methodologies used. So if anyone's interested in methodologies used, assumptions made, data sources, what emission factor was used and where it came from, that is all publicly available as well. So I think that's it with that. I'll pause. I know that there were a few questions shared beforehand that I think I did my best to respond to all of them, but if not, feel free to ask them again now for clarifying or follow up on email, via email. But with that, I'll open up for some questions.
Commissioner Murski? You're on mute.
Thank you. Tia, I just a question about missing data. My understanding was that you said that we still don't have data from DTE on, I think we grouped as commercial and industrial buildings. Is that correct? For
Yes.
3 years now?
For, I think it's 2 years now.
Well, go ahead.
No,
I'll just go ahead then.
Let's see what your question is. Yeah.
I would make an appeal to Councilmember Adina and to council in general to intercede where possible, potentially through the Michigan Municipal League and through other entities, because this is just really unacceptable. I hope the VP that was listening in earlier from DTE is still listening in, and he recognizes that it's really unacceptable that we don't get this. Just more generally, I'm also concerned that we had this report in August of last year where we had the inventory presented, and we agreed at that time that we would like to see this earlier in the year. And I know that we had problems with getting data again this year more generally. I can only say that any business would never be driving by looking in the rearview mirror 8 months in arrears. And really, this is something that we really need to improve on. And I think we need people in high places, talking to other people in high places, whether it's at the MPSC or whatever, to address that situation. Just if I may, just 2 comments that I have for now. You don't have to go to the slide, or you can if you want to. Slide 7. I think if we are all to do a mental best fit slope on slide 7, there we are of what our emissions reductions have been 2015 to the present. And you look at that slope, and then you look at the slope that's necessary. We really need to double down. And I'm really concerned. Obviously, there's some big drops foreseen in the 820 plan, where we go to 100% clean renewable power through CCA or through some other means. But nevertheless, this is really a daunting task. The other thing that I want to point out is on slide 12, if you can go to that. This is residential emissions. You can see basically in 2022, we're exactly where we were in 2015 through 2017, 2018. Basically, on average, we really haven't changed much. And what I think we all have to recognize is that as far as I know, since 2020, roughly since June of 2020, when A20 was approved, roughly 2,600 new housing units have been approved by the Planning Commission and City Council. Probably very few of those are reflected in any of these figures yet, and the vast majority of those are all natural gas connected. So that's, I think there's roughly 50,000 residential units in the city right now, and that means we're adding another 5%, and most of those are natural gas connected, and those are not going to be converted to 100% electric in the next 15 years, probably, because these are all new units. So what we're not seeing here is this trend that was coming out of the pandemic from 2020 to 2022 is most likely going to continue to be on this curve, at least for emissions from residential buildings. Those are my only two comments. And as you know, I posted a lot of, provided a lot of comments before the meeting. You addressed many of them. I'll go over and look at those again, and I'll ask you if you wouldn't mind to respond to any that I think at least I still have a question in my mind on. Thank you.
All right. Hey, Thea, would you mind not unsharing so I could see the good people? Thank you so much. Anybody else? Yes, Commissioner Murski. You're on mute.
I do have one other question, since there was at least a few second pregnant pause there, and that is the University of Michigan has decreased. Let me see, where's my little sleep paper that I jotted this down. It reported in fiscal year 21 net emissions equal to gross emissions of 523,000 metric tons of CO2e. In fiscal year 2022, it indicated through its tracking that gross emissions rose to 576,000 metric tons of CO2. That's an increase of 10%. But their net emissions dropped to 486,000, or a drop of 10% versus the prior year. So that's a delta of 20%. And this difference between net and gross is in an Excel file that is accessible through the Office of Sustainability's metrics. And if I'm not mistaken, in my recollection, the first year there was a difference between net and gross was this year. And I'm not aware that the university is buying any offsets. And I'm wondering if this is some kind of new accounting for green power purchases. And I guess lastly, if these numbers from the university are correct, then that would mean that the reduction that we've seen in emissions from 2019 to 2022, all of those reductions have come through actions from the university, and none have come from the city. So if you go back and look at emissions in 2019, granted U of M is reporting on a fiscal year, but if you look at the delta between emissions in 2019 versus what they are currently at U of M, it's something like a drop from 640,000 metric tons of CO2 down to this new net figure of 487,000. If you take that delta is the entire emissions reduction for the community. I put some of that in my email to you, not this net gross difference. I'm hoping that Thea, you or Peck can speak to some of these figures, or at least conceptually.
I will do my best, and I'm going to clarify. I'm not going to attempt at mental math since it is nearing my bedtime. So I hope everyone apologizes for that. If you want specific numbers, feel free to follow up in an email, and I'll be happy to look into things. Some things I will share. So if you're saying that the emissions decreases are only coming from U of M, we can see, looking at the inventory broken out by different sectors, that decreases have come from certain sectors specifically. For example, transportation, the EMT is lower than 2019. You can see for transportation, just the total emissions amounts are lower for that specific sector. If you were saying that the U of M's total decrease is equivalent to the city's total decrease, because we've also had some sectors increase as well. I think that's what you're saying. I will say, if you go through U of M's shared spreadsheet on their inventory, I don't look at it and take out an aggregate number. I pull out specific data points that they share on, specifically how much fossil fuels they're consuming, things like how much fuel they're using on their buses, things like how much natural gas they're using both in their buildings and in their power plant. Sometimes they use some fuel oil, and then how much electricity they're purchasing. They also report on how much renewable energy purchases they're making as well. And so U of M has shared that they are starting to, they account for that in their inventory, because they don't have to follow the same protocol that I follow. And so they are able to kind of like claim that and share that as an official inventory. It may be a question going forward on how we share information on renewable energy purchases, kind of for informational purposes, not necessarily for this is Ann Arbor's official inventory, as I think that difference will continue to become more significant in upcoming years.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Overbeck.
Yeah, I can't answer the question either. But I suggest we get Shauna Weber, our new Associate VP for Sustainability, to come and join us, and maybe bring a staff member who really knows this stuff. And we should, because it might be, we don't want to put her on the spot. That'd be a horrible way to start a good relationship. And certainly the new president is very committed to reducing our emissions and speeding that up, as is the CFO, who is Shauna's boss. She reports to both of them. And she comes from Princeton, so she has experience with the university and all that. So we'll get the answers we're after. The one thing I can offer is what we're doing now, trying to do is zero out our scope 2 emissions. And I think we're really close. In other words, we said we'd do it by 2025. And the Office of Sustainability keeps saying we're going to do it, and we're going to actually reach the finish line before then. At the same time, and we've got big RFPs out on that, a big RFP out on that front. But we also have, for renewable energy, we also have a fairly sizable one. And I can't remember the numbers, but pretty big and surprisingly big for on-campus generation. So it'll count against scope 1.
5 megawatts is what I recall.
What is it?
I think so.
5?
And I know the city is piggybacking their RFP.
Yeah.
With the universities,
Yeah.
At least in terms of the structure and things like that. Joe, do you know if the 25 megawatt is correct?
I don't have the number off the top of my head.
I think 25
somewhere around there
good to
sounds
me.
right.
Yeah. But that's like, given that the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality did not suggest doing that because it is more expensive. I personally like the idea because, we want to show what we're doing, not just do it. But in any case, it's good news. And then, of course, we've started our first geothermal field for one of our new buildings. So that whole enterprise is often to a slow, but nonetheless, I think meaningful start. And the big thing that hasn't been finished yet is an assessment. Well, two things. One is an assessment of what we could, if anything, use offsets for. And even though I was kind of supportive of that, and I'd say a minority of our President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality were eager to do it. It would cost more money, but it would get us to zero faster. And then we could backfill with real local Michigan action and on campus. But the point is that still has to be done. And then Greg Keoli and Vince's is doing the scope 3. He's leading a team to do the scope 3 assessment, which, as far as I can tell, isn't going to be done at all for a little while, 2025 too. But that doesn't mean we won't make progress on scope 2. So I think that's, I'm not an expert. I could, if I wasn't lazy, just go on the website. All this is reported, so people can see it. But a lot of work remains to be done. Hope that helps a little.
Vice Chair Hart.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a question about the resolution of some of the data and the inventory, particularly, and I guess the question is about how resolved can it get beyond the year, and are some of these data, either in terms of fuel mix or otherwise, for the different sectors, something that can be looked at either seasonally or monthly? And if so, in your opinion, does that sort of have any benefit in terms of the potential for how we look at or potentially target some of the opportunities to make reductions? And I'm thinking primarily of sort of what we saw with the pandemic, in that, there are changes of behavior, and if we look a little bit more closely at them, we can see that, and we know. I would imagine that we're using more natural gas, for example, during the winter than the summer, and vice versa. So I guess it's just a question of sort of how we look at how highly resolved, or if there's any benefit to looking at it more granularly beyond the year.
Yeah, so currently nearly every data source I use is provided on an annual basis, especially the ones for the largest emission sources on buildings. So the consumption is provided as an annual aggregate total. The fuel mix is provided annually. It used to be provided every other year, so that feels like an improvement. And then transportation is also provided on an annual total. Commissioner Mirsky had mentioned on the timeline of these, that data source comes out later this year than they expected. It came out late May or early June this year. So it kind of hinders when you really want to be looking at the data. I acknowledge that's a pain point. The one data source that we do currently have more frequent reporting on is our waste data, which is a relatively small in terms of emission impact. It of course has larger impact in terms of sustainability in general. And we do have more time granular data available there. I do think there could be relevance, especially for electricity, at looking at more granular data if it were ever to be available. There are specific situations, like especially as we look at increasing the renewable percentage of our energy, and electrifying, or even before electrifying buildings in general. I think it'll be important to see the emissions intensity in the winter when renewables might be offline versus in the summer and things like that. Other cities have actually looked at adopting 24/7 renewable energy standards. So pairing hourly total energy consumption with renewables, since you can look at this aggregate annual total, but the hourly data might actually tell a really different story. And so some other cities have started to tackle looking at that level of detail.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Sia, again for joining us. We're going to move along in the interest of time. All right, going to the next agenda item. Can we have news from the Energy Office and any commissioners who have news to share?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Don't have couple notes. As I'm sure some of you are aware, heard the home energy rating disclosure ordinance had its first hearing at council last night. Again, remember, I know it's been a couple months, but the Energy Commission did have that initial hearing of it and did provide feedback, which was incorporated into that version. There'll be, I believe, a second reading will be coming soon. So feel free to check in on the council meetings for that. But again, thanks for the feedback that went into that. Also want to note in terms of I have too many things open. Did want to note that coming up this Friday from 5 to 9, the Ann Arbor Farmers Market. We're having our second annual Home Electrification Expo. This is an event that has a bunch of contractors that are doing work in the electrification and decarbonization space. Give people an opportunity to interact with contractors, learn more about it, and just kind of see what could potentially make sense. So if you're available or know of others who might be interested, encourage you to check that out. I think those are the main updates I have right now.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing that news. Okay, and Commissioner Murski, would you like to report on the Environmental Commission?
Sorry. It's ironic that I have nothing to report because the Environmental Commission meeting was canceled because it was during the power outage that we had. So just one more impact.
Yes, well, that speaks for itself. Okay, we'll move to our final public comment section. This is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes.
Chair McKenna, sorry.
Yes.
Could I also just? I wanted to add on to Joe's comment. So in addition to HERD passing first reading last night, when second reading comes, it will have a public hearing attached to it. And so I just also wanted to emphasize that if folks wanted to call in, while it did pass first reading unanimously last night, there is still some considerable opposition to it. I think there are still probably a few questions that will get asked between now and second reading. And so for those folks who I know who have been working on this for a long time, if you wanted to call in or to come to the meeting and participate, make sure you pay attention for the public hearing. And then we also had the nomination of a new energy commissioner. And so hopefully that will be approved at our next meeting as well.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. All right, so we'll move into our last opportunity for public input. This is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes. If you're watching on CTN, please call 888-788-0099 or 877-853-5247 and enter the meeting ID 956-8718-7876. This information is also displayed on the meeting agenda and video feed. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone number. To electronically raise your hand to indicate your desire to speak, please press *9 on your phone. You will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute television or background sounds so that we may hear you clearly. And please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. Joe, do we have anybody on the line?
Yes. Caller ending in 134.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. This is Ken Garber again. Thank you for the really great discussion on both the grid and the inventory. Yeah, a few words about the inventory. Whether or not the weather in 2022 and higher DTE carbon intensity were responsible for the 2022 emissions increase, overall, we're not reducing emissions by the 15 to 20% annually that we need to. I'm not just talking about the 820 goal. I'm talking about the entire developed world needs to do this because we put off any kind of meaningful action for the last 30 years. We're faced with this cliff. To me, it looks impossible. It looks like we're doomed to fail. Emissions are actually going up. Probably will continue to do so on the local level with all the new gas-fired construction projects approved and in the review or planning process. Buildings and transportation are the big sectors, and we continue to build with gas, do very few electric retrofits. People are driving more and more, bigger and bigger vehicles. And the inventory doesn't even try to estimate Scope 3 emissions, which are supply chain and personal consumption. I think Cornell recently published a study showing that Scope 3 represented 60% of their emissions. We have no idea what's going on with these in Ann Arbor. Our emissions may be much higher than what the inventory shows, and may be going up even faster as people travel more, order more stuff for delivery and otherwise. My point is, we are failing here in Ann Arbor as well as nationally. Yet the messaging from the city is unrelentingly positive. I realize that the city's philosophy is that you cannot motivate people with fear and negativity. Maybe not, but we're certainly not changing behavior now, except for the worse. I think somehow we've got to change both the tone and substance of the way we communicate the dire situation that we're in. We need to tell people that what we're doing is not working. The implication that we can somehow make this huge change without altering fundamentally the very destructive way all of us live, including making the necessary personal sacrifices, is just not correct
30 seconds.
in my view. I guess I look at this inventory and I am incredibly demoralized and depressed, and I don't really see a path forward. And I wish I had something more constructive to communicate, except that we all have to just keep trying. But I think we have to acknowledge, above all, that what we've done so far is not working.
Thank you. No further callers.
Okay, on that sobering note, I have a couple of comments on items for next agenda, and I'd also like to hear if anything comes to mind, quickly-ish. So let's see, I wrote down some thoughts kind of going from the back to the front. Having Shauna Weber from University of Michigan come on and maybe share more recent plans for decarbonization at U of M. I'd like to, incorporate a little bit more of a conversation and maybe have some other folks. Heck, if you'd like to speak, we could have others from SEAS or others at the university. I think that'd be really nice. I also noted that, I invited Mike Butkowski back potentially to speak later in the year or maybe next year, depending on the urgency, around just trust in the company and talking about an analysis of the history of how we got here from a reliability sense. And I have some notes on what specifically I would ask. Does anybody else have anything else that came up for them that they'd like to get on that list? Your heart.
Yeah, we with the discussion today, we heard a lot about the sort of systems level resilience facing Ann Arbor, particularly with the spectrum grid. And one of the things I think that potentially would be helpful is how we might also take up sort of individual household neighborhood resilience as well, particularly with respect to sort of things that whether individual renters or homeowners might be able to do to help in terms of their own setups and systems and the ways that they're sort of experiencing this. And yeah, I don't have a particular suggestion, I think, for how to accomplish that, but there may be some options in terms of who are able to get to speak to that.
Great. Yeah, I also heard a mention in the greenhouse gas inventory about sort of marginal emissions or hourly emissions. I know that that's of interest or has been stated in the past, so maybe we can incorporate that as well into future discussions. Now that we've had the discussion about the inventory, we can kind of broaden that and talk more about the implications. Commissioner Marsky?
I'd be very interested in a report from the city about how the city plans to take the really great effort in the Bryant neighborhood. My understanding, it's roughly 260 households, and how that effort is planned to be rolled out citywide and replicated and accelerated, particularly in light of Mr. Garber's comments. We're now 3 years into the plan. We've got a great grant to look at a networked geothermal heating system for that neighborhood. That's probably a year out until that's done. That means it's still not implemented. So the question is, how do you take that model and accelerate that and roll it out to all these different subdivisions, to apartment complexes, and so on and so forth? I mean, I grew up in Ann Arbor, so I could, tick off 10 different subdivisions and neighborhoods across the city where we need to have a similar effort, and we only have 7 years to do that. So we've got one neighborhood that's going well, and we probably have 50 neighborhoods that need to be where we need to be doing the same thing. So if we could, that may be something that is not realistic in the next couple of months, but it should be something that we look to hear about certainly at the end of the year or early next year.
Thanks. And would you look to the OSI, or there may be other city departments that would be helpful? Just trying to get some more perspectives and think about the reality of what that rollout looks like.
It could be a team effort. It could be, yeah, and yeah. But I think it probably has to be led by OSI.
For sure. Hey, anything else? Right, seeing none, I'm going to move on. Okay, great. So we're ready to adjourn. It is now 8:24, and I declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you so much for your participation.
Good night, everybody.
See you next month.
Thanks all.